Welcome, everybody. My name is John Mandyck. I'm the CEO of Urban Green, and I'm coming to you live from Studio Urban Green at our office in very snowy Lower Manhattan. This is a program series where I'll be interviewing global experts to better understand how we get to a zero carbon future. And the best part is you get to participate too, because we're going to have live Q&A in just a little bit. Now, today, we look at the future of energy efficiency and the future of renewables and clean energy in New York State. And in a year like none other, I thought it would be timely to touch base with the very person in charge of these very important issues. So I'm excited to welcome Doreen Harris, the acting president and CEO of NYSERDA. NYSERDA invests billions of dollars to advance energy efficiency in all ways, and they're charged with executing the state's clean energy transformation. So Doreen, welcome to Urban Green Live. It's great to have you on the program.
Thank you for having me, Caitlin and John. It's a pleasure. I'm coming to you from snowy Albany. So great to speak with you today.
Great. And happy Groundhog's Day, Doreen.
Indeed.
That's right. Punxsutawney Phil saw his shadow, so winter's going to be hanging around. So energy efficiency is even more important when we think about heating. So let's start there with energy efficiency. And Doreen, maybe start with the question that's probably on the top of mind for most, which is, has the pandemic altered the state's approach to energy efficiency or clean energy for that matter?
Sure. Yes, it certainly has been a challenging year in so many regards, 2020 and now 2021. But, you know, we as a state are incredibly, and even more so, I believe, fortunate to have Governor Cuomo's leadership in not only handling the state's response to the pandemic, but to the discussion today, to utilizing clean energy as a tool for rebuilding our economy and for protecting our most vulnerable communities who we can all realize have been affected by COVID disproportionately, but of course as well by climate change. So this year launched a really exciting set of initiatives by the governor in his State of the State address. One of the pillars of that address was the green economy, and to utilize green energy to address the climate crisis, but also to ensure that clean energy can be utilized to create opportunities for economic development as well. So in many ways, it couldn't be a better time through this pandemic and as we emerge to utilize these policies. The state's policy of the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act is the driver of our work. I'm happy to talk about any of the details of that policy, certainly nation leading in many respects, but it has garnered a reality of job creation already that is particularly relevant as we emerge from the pandemic. We publish a clean energy industry report every year. It's a longitudinal study that looks at the emergence of and evolution of clean energy jobs across the state. And 2019 was a banner year. We had over 160,000 clean energy jobs across our state at that point. Admittedly, the clean energy jobs were growing at a rate far beyond, in fact, 3 times faster than New York's general job growth. However, of course, like everything else, COVID did impact the clean energy jobs in 2020. But we're pleased to say that our most recent report demonstrates the fact that they are emerging and remerging as the pandemic subsides. So certainly we can see that our workforce and our policies are serving this goal very nicely together, and I would say in a way that it creates an incredible opportunity for alignment. Has the pandemic impacted our work? Certainly. NYSERDA ourselves, we've had to really think hard about where we sit in all of this space. You had mentioned energy efficiency. it's a perfect example of one of the challenges we saw. Certainly some of the issues around air quality has been an area that has impacted questions around efficiency in the past year. Specifically, wherein some of the challenges with improving air quality have resulted in impacts to building efficiency. So one of the partnerships that we at NYSERDA are most proud of in the past year was a partnership we forged with ASHRAE, the American Society of Heating, Refrigerating, and Air Conditioning Engineers, where we looked notably to not only look at energy studies, but also to address the need for COVID mitigating air quality considerations, but while still preserving energy efficiency opportunities in these buildings. So it's a good example of how we've had to pivot in the energy space this year, for sure. And then we at NYSERDA generally have had to pivot. We certainly wanted to retain as many of those 164,000 jobs as possible. So we've had to be deliberate as to accommodating not only programmatically the challenges the companies were facing, but also to utilize workforce training programs to not only prioritize safety, but also flexibility as we look to retain those positions.
Right.
So a lot of perspectives here to put together.
Yeah.
But a big year nevertheless.
For sure. Let's dive into energy efficiency first, and then we'll come back and talk about clean energy. So, sometimes I have this view that energy efficiency really is in the back seat of people's minds now. It's been along for a long time, and people are looking at the shiny new object in front when really energy efficiency still has a big role to play. So I guess my question to you is, what makes you excited about the future of energy efficiency? Are there technology breakthroughs that you see that are going to get us further down the path with efficiency?
Sure, yes, and that's one of the great parts of my job as the acting president and CEO of NYSERDA, is that although I had spent my career working in the renewable space, I'm now able to really look at this very significant opportunity that energy efficiency creates. You're absolutely right. It is the starting point for our work and is notably a massive component of the CLCPA. I had mentioned the jobs that we saw in the clean energy industry. I think it's very important to note that 77% of those jobs are in energy efficiency. So in the first instance, I think it is important to note that it is a huge economic driver. The activity itself is a huge job creator here in the state and beyond. And indeed, it is a huge component of our broader CLCPA goals. Notably, the CLCPA includes a target of 185 trillion BTUs of end-use energy savings, just as in the first instance. But where that opportunity exists, of course, is primarily in our buildings and where we can realize those savings to not only improve on efficiency, but also cut greenhouse gas emissions as well. So we at NYSERDA administer the Clean Energy Fund. The Clean Energy Fund is expected to deliver about 53 TBTUs of that 185 TBTU goal that I just described. And so one great thing that we've been able to look at in the past year is our progress toward that goal. And I'm pleased to say we're on track to hit our contributions. But it is true that there are other opportunities in the midst with respect to buildings, as I said, not only from the perspective of efficiency, but also what we would call beneficial electrification. And a great example of that is the utilization of heat pump technologies, which can be equally impactful in buildings to decarbonize our building stock, but of course is on the opposite side of the equation, a balance for sure. But we are scaling up efficiency and electrification in buildings through multiple programs that I'm sure your members and those listening today are well aware of. last year, we launched what I think is one of the most exciting opportunities to decarbonize high-rise buildings. The Empire Building Challenge was issued last year. It's a $50 million effort to essentially support replicable and scalable solutions for that building stock, which for us is very relevant in the New York market where you sit in Manhattan. Particular unique challenges exist in that stock. So it's a great example of looking at this in a very New York context.
Right.
So I hope that helps.
Yeah, absolutely. So you mentioned some big numbers there on the CLCPA and the role efficiency can play. If you kind of fast forward maybe to 2050 when we hope we're all at net zero or getting closer to a zero carbon future, what slice of the pie or what proportion do you think energy efficiency plays to get us there?
Well, when we look at it collectively, the emissions, again, from buildings are, over 30% of what we're trying to get at. And efficiency is a major component of that achievement. That's, fundamentally the reality that we're looking at. Efficiency improvements certainly are going to help us hit that 185 TBTU goal. I think that's important. But the thing that was pretty relevant for me, and putting that in a context that is useful for me, again, being newer to the industry, is that's equivalent to saving the energy consumed by 1.8 million New York homes. So when you look at a population of 90 million New Yorkers, that really helps me put it into context of what that 185 TBTUs means. So when we look at our work to decarbonize buildings, it is true that in the first instance, we do have this desire and need to reduce energy demand. We have a lot of things we're doing to do so. I'm sure you're well familiar, but we have various programs that are focused on increasing efficiency, but then in addition on electrification as well as an opportunity. And when we put that all together, there's a couple of roadmaps that we at NYSERDA are working on advancing and that will be issued this year. First, the Carbon Neutral Buildings Roadmap, really an exciting piece of work that not only is analytic, but also based in consumer and outreach to building owners. It's really looking at means by which we can create buildings with superior energy performance as well as replicable opportunities for broader building applicability. In addition, we're creating, to my second point, the Building Electrification Roadmap, which is looking at the transition. How are we specifically able to electrify buildings over the next 10 years as well? So certainly we have a lot in action, but also in the planning stages as well.
Right. So as I mentioned, today's Groundhog's Day. It's kind of a magical day. So if I gave you a magic wand right now, Doreen, what advancement or what breakthrough or what barrier would you want to tear down when it comes to the future of energy efficiency?
I think the issues that we have here in the Northeast are particularly challenging. I think the biggest challenge that I see from this perch is the very large proportion of older buildings that we have in the Northeast and specifically in New York. Those buildings are particularly more challenging to decarbonize because they would need to be modernized, of course, as well as invested in. And I think, when we look at where the opportunities exist, most notably for New York with respect to efficiency, it has to do with making investments in those properties, not only to make, improve their efficiency, but I think the real linchpin to all of this is to look at the quality of life of the people inhabiting those buildings. And for us, that's really what it comes down to, is it comes down to a question of healthy living that is for us, the most meaningful change that we need to think about, it's not just about efficiency, it's about who we are and how we live as New Yorkers. These buildings are particularly challenging, but what it all comes down to is our commitment to position our building stock to meaningfully contribute to these goals. But to do so, it comes down to people and people's quality of life.
So let's transition and talk about clean energy. But before we do that, I want to remind the audience to use the Q&A box to ask your questions, and we'll get to those in just a few minutes. So maybe the best place to start, Doreen, is can you just ground us again on the state's goals for renewables and clean energy?
Sure, definitely. So the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act sets forth a number of goals related to clean energy. I think the two that are most relevant for this discussion has to do with a 2030 target for 70% of our electricity to be consumed from renewables. And then further, when we look to 2040, there is a goal for 100% zero emission electricity sector by 2040. And this is the primary North Star when it comes to clean energy development. Just to give everyone some context where we sit today, in fact, we just filed our annual report on this process, on our progress. We're at 27% renewable in New York State. Comprised primarily of hydroelectric generation from investments made many years ago, and then with increasing amounts of wind and solar serving New Yorkers. And when we look at sort of how we get from here to there, NYSERDA has a very central role in helping that be accomplished. And in fact, in this year's State of the State address, Governor Cuomo in his green economy and green energy speech made note of the fact that we have 100, almost 100 projects that are awarded and contracted by NYSERDA with the primary goal of increasing that number from 27% to 70% and beyond. And in fact, when we look at the pipeline of projects that we now have, again, awarded and contracted by NYSERDA, they're solar projects, they're land-based wind projects, there's a couple hydroelectric projects in the mix, and then a new game changer that I'm sure we'll be talking about is offshore wind. When you add all of those up, where we sit today, those projects will allow us to get to over 50% renewable when they enter operation. So it's an aggressive goal, no doubt, but very achievable when we look at the pipeline plus our commitment to continue to fill that pipeline with additional renewables.
Right. So let's talk about the offshore wind. It's very exciting for us here in New York. Yeah. When will work begin, and when will we really know that it's actually really real?
Sure. Yes. As soon as our listeners learn about offshore wind, they'll never go back. It's one of these just amazing disruptive technologies that has come into applicability in a state like New York, and not that many years ago. Offshore wind has been developed in Europe for many years, and Governor Cuomo set forth through the CLCPA a goal of 9,000 megawatts of offshore wind development by 2035, which places New York front and center, the largest goal in the nation, and in fact, incorporated within this year's State of the State address was an announcement of an award. For someone like me, even for me, it was pretty jaw-dropping. We awarded this year 2,490 megawatts of offshore wind for two massive projects off the coast of New York City and on Long Island. So that's a huge chunk toward our 9 gigawatt goal, especially when added to our previous awards, which are over 1,800 megawatts. So to your question as to when these projects will come to fruition, they are massive infrastructure projects, and they take a good number of years to develop and become operational. Our first offshore wind project for the state is the South Fork Wind Farm, which is expected to enter operation in the next, I'd say 2 years. Sorry, I had to look at what year we were in. Within the next 2 years, with the other projects filing in thereafter over the next, several years thereafter. But what is really awesome about offshore wind is not just the generation that it provides, which is admittedly a massive amount. Just to give you an order of magnitude, 9 gigawatts of offshore wind, when it's operational, will serve about a third of New York's load. So it's huge. It's just huge in many respects, beyond generation even. And the part that is going to happen before these projects enter operation is investments in our state with respect to port facilities, manufacturing, and other economic development opportunities that will be brought to bear well before the projects themselves enter operation. So we in New York have 5 different ports now serving the offshore wind industry, including some major announcements at South Brooklyn Marine Terminal in your neck of the woods, and the Port of Albany in my neck of the woods, to serve that industry in manufacturing, installation, and operations and maintenance activities. So I think for me, it is already very real. It isn't the case that we need to wait for the mid 2020s for it to be real. These investments are happening today.
So in the South Fork, is construction actually begun? Or are they still in the permitting process? Are the pilings going in the water? I mean, what state is it at?
Sure. Yeah. The South Fork Wind Farm, again, is actually a project that was awarded by the Long Island Power Authority to serve a very specific need on the South Fork. There was load growth in the South Fork of Long Island, and they sought multiple proposals to serve that need, including conventional generation, as well as other renewable resources. And in the end, this particular project best suited the needs of the South Fork and will be New York's first offshore wind project. The South Fork project is, as we speak, wrapping up permitting activities and also host community negotiations with respect to host community payments and the like. They are anticipated to begin, sort of their initial construction activities in this coming year. But just suffice it to say, this is not a construction activity that takes, weeks or months. These are long-term operations that require investments not only in the ocean but on land. So the commercial operation date, as I said, in late 22 or early 23, will be preceded by at least 1 year of construction.
So the last time you spoke to an Urban Green audience was at our conference in June, which, as you recall, was all about unlocking green power for New York.
Yep.
So I guess my question is, do you think the answer for greening the grid in New York City lies more in these additional generation projects that we're talking about, or actually in the additional transmission projects to kind of overcome the bottleneck that we have right now?
Yeah, I think for me, it's probably both. As I said, it is true that the New York City grid is particularly challenging to decarbonize, for sure. I think one opportunity that we've already discussed is this reality of offshore wind providing a massive influx of renewables into the city, which is, as I said, a game changer by any estimation. But in addition, we're looking at other opportunities to green the grid. In fact, as we speak, NYSERDA has an RFP on the street. It's not the best name. It's called Tier 4, but it's explicitly looking for renewables to deliver into Zone J, into the New York City market, to deliver that green energy directly, again, in this geography that is, as I said, particularly hard to decarbonize. So in my view, it will be a combination of transmission and generation that ultimately helps to address not only the need for renewables, but also the balancing needs that would be prevalent in that future.
Right. So I just have two more questions and we'll get the audience questions are coming in. So that's great. It's good
Great.
to see we have a great discussion. So, whether it's the additional transmission that we just talked about or the generation, the offshore, when do you actually think New York City will start to see the benefit of those? Like, when will the green power start to flow?
Sure. Yeah. So again, the two examples that I had just provided, just to give you some idea of the timing, there are two projects, well, actually three projects right now from an offshore wind perspective that are anticipated to deliver into New York City. First, we have the Empire Wind offshore wind project that is planning to interconnect into the Gowanus substation, so very directly impactful to the city. That project is expected to enter operation toward the end of 24 and early into 2025. So that's a great example of massive influx of renewables from that first offshore wind project in that time frame. We're in the midst of our big RFP for the renewables delivered into the city. So time will tell as to when those projects will be able to begin delivering. In large part, they will involve new transmission build out, which is, again, a multi-year activity, but it could be within that same time frame.
Okay, good. So we have a new administration in Washington, D.C.
Mm-hmm.
And so how can the Biden administration and its approach to climate change, what role can Washington play to help accelerate either efficiency or clean energy in New York?
Sure. Yes, it is certainly a new day for those of us working in clean energy under President Biden. And when we look at the plan that he has set forth and in fact has begun to implement already, it is literally, it's as if you're reading the New York playbook, but on a federal level. There are plans specifically on a federal level now to build a broader, modern, and sustainable infrastructure initiatives, but to look at all of this through the perspective of equity, which is also one critical element, an overarching element of New York's CLCPA. I think for us, the investments that President Biden anticipates making in clean energy, not just from the perspective of the power generation sector that we've been talking about or efficiency, but also with respect to transit, the auto industry, and innovation. We haven't talked much about innovation, but even beyond that, with this overlay of environmental and climate justice considerations, really puts us into a very, very close alignment in our mutual goals. So for us, the next 4 years will provide certainly strong opportunities to further our work and New York's leadership on a national and global level. I think that's true, but also I think there are now new and exciting opportunities for federal-state collaboration that are being brought forth even now. I had mentioned the Empire Buildings Challenge. I would believe that there is a strong opportunity to look at that model on a nationwide level. But then also, we've been talking about offshore wind. New York needs the federal government to permit and identify locations for offshore wind projects. So that's another great opportunity for New York to benefit as the Federal Bureau of Ocean Energy Management is advancing new lease areas for New York, as well as permitting those projects that result in an expeditious manner. So I think, it's sort of like the sky's the limit. We're looking at opportunities for energy storage expansion. I think that's a huge precursor for the renewable generation penetration that we're looking at. I think it is also true that we would really be wanting to look at a federal initiative with respect to appliance standards, another major driver of efficiency that we believe we can realize here in New York, but those that were actually rolled back under previous federal administration. And then broadly, from an innovation perspective, continued and expanded collaboration with the Federal Department of Energy as well to advance the innovation programs that we at NYSERDA support. So lots of opportunities. We're not just dusting off our playbook from 4 years ago. You know, the world has changed a lot in that time, not only with New York's goals, but also with the strong focus on issues of equity and justice as being central to our work.
Great. And so let's start with the audience questions, and it's a great transition to our first question. I'll remind the audience that you can upvote questions, and I can see right now we have a heck of a lot more questions that we're going to be able to answer in the next 30 minutes. So if you see a question that you want to vote to the top of the line, please do that. So the first question is about equity and justice, and it comes from Donna. It says, what is the update on NYSERDA's focus on incorporating environmental justice and frontline community needs? How is the Just Transition Advisory Committee and the working group helping to guide these concerns?
Great question. So I didn't get into this in our initial Q&A, but I, along with Commissioner Sagos, co-chair New York's Climate Action Council, which has been hard at work in implementing the policies and analysis needed to realize the goals of the CLCPA. We, in the past year, had the benefit of empaneling our 7 advisory panels and really getting to work on the important aspects of making recommendations to achieve the goals. On the very particular question from Donna, I also have the distinction of co-chairing the Just Transition Working Group with Commissioner Reardon at the Department of Labor, as well as we have formed the Climate Justice Working Group, which is primarily tasked with identifying this very question of the definitional aspects of benefits. The CLCPA sets forth a very clear objective to bring forth at least 35% of benefits to disadvantaged communities. And we take very seriously the realization of those goals. So in the first instance, our work is underway in really establishing that foundation for our work to be built around that requirement. Closer to home, we at NYSERDA have been working very, very diligently to ensure that our portfolio of investments brings forth at least those benefits as well. So a couple markers just for your point of reference. The first is the RGGI operating plan that we have put forth, and in fact will be taken up tomorrow by NYSERDA's board. It looks forward at the investments that we propose and sets forth, based on our analysis of at least the initial markers of the definition of disadvantaged communities. It brings forth benefits estimated at 39% going forward for our RGGI investments, just as an example. In addition, we filed late last year our look forward for the Clean Energy Fund, as I said, the primary instrument that NYSERDA utilizes in achieving these goals on an efficiency side in particular. And similarly, that portfolio moving forward has similar expectations to not only meet but exceed the goals of the CLCPA. So I think in the one instance, we have sort of a process in place to put forth these rules and requirements broadly, but I would also say that at NYSERDA, we're not wasting time in ensuring that our programs are fully compliant.
Okay, next question. They keep popping around here because people keep voting. So let me check this one. It says, what's going to happen when Indian Point goes offline later this year? What will fill that generation gap, and what does it mean for New York City's carbon footprint? So I think we've gotten into this. I guess the question is really the syncing on timing here, right? And so Indian Point goes offline later this year, but renewables, will flow a couple years later. So, what's the thinking on that gap in between?
Sure. Yes. So first of all, it's important to note that we have, and this isn't so much a NYSERDA function, but a function of the New York Independent System Operator and the Department of Public Service have looked at issues around, or looked at the question of reliability associated with the Indian Point closure. And there have been conclusions that, we as a state are strongly positioned from the perspective of generation, supply of generation and the reliability of that generation in the first instance. It is true, clearly, that I had just described the timelines that are at play here with this influx of renewable generation into the city. And there is obviously a gap between the two that is, just sort of a fact of the matter. I think the good news is, of course, the indications are strong that we are in good shape from the perspective of system reliability in the meantime. But we are not wasting time in expediting project development. I want you to recognize that, whomever had asked the question. We had just a year ago, or just less than a year ago, in the middle of the COVID pandemic, Governor Cuomo advanced what I call the Siting Act. It has a much longer name, but I'll call it the Accelerated Siting Act, which was with this goal in mind to say, we're not just going to set goals, we need to actually put steel in the ground and to achieve them. And so we as a state have been hard at work to accelerate the development of renewable resources. Again, not only just to replace Indian Point's generation, but more broadly to get us from that 27% to 70 and beyond. So that's where we are on that question.
Next question is about codes. So is the state moving to a net zero or carbon neutral energy code? And if so, when and how?
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question. Couple of things that I'd like to highlight. Just I guess it was about it wasn't even 2 weeks ago. Now that I think about it, it was last week. Gosh, time flies. We issued our Clean Energy Communities Leadership Round last week, which is among the goals of the Clean Energy Communities program, which has been adopted by literally, I think the numbers of more than 300 local communities who have already earned the Clean Energy Community designation. I'd say this new leadership round, which is $17 million, emphasizes new activities and impacts that can be realized by these communities. And one of them does include adoption of the NY Stretch Energy Code as a potential action that could be implemented relevant to the question at play. I think, more broadly, the question of codes is one. I had mentioned that we have impaneled our 7 advisory panels in response to the CLCPA requirements. And one of them, the Energy Efficiency and Housing Panel, is looking very notably at recommendations as we speak today. In fact, the recommendations are due to be delivered to the Climate Action Council this spring. And so in doing so, that's exactly the question of codes and standards is one that panel is bringing forth to the council, which is to say, what, if any, codes should be considered, and to what extent will they help us achieve the goals of the CLCPA? I know that's been a central question before that panel, and ultimately will be, I'm sure, the subject of their recommendations to us.
Okay, next question. Has the state considered direct investment in improving the efficiency in public housing? History tells us that the market has never properly served this sector, and it's essential that these buildings get modernized. So what's your view on improving efficiency public housing? How can we do it better?
Yeah, it's also a great question. And I should have noted, although I think it's more relevant for this purpose, when we look at that Energy Efficiency and Housing Panel that is now well where the work is now underway. One of the chairs of that panel is the commissioner from the New York State Homes and Community Renewal Agency, in partnership with NYSERDA. So HCR, as it's known, is central to the work that we are advancing as a state for those exact reasons. So I think there's a lot of great examples where we are looking explicitly at the housing portfolio referenced by the questioner. One milestone that was announced last month by Governor Cuomo was a new initiative called Raise the Green Roof. And that is explicitly directing HCR and NYSERDA to deploy retrofits and electrification measures and solar on HCR's affordable housing portfolio. So I think that's a great example of a very direct injection of investment in the owners of those buildings, and will allow a large number, on the order of 5,000 affordable housing units, to deploy those measures statewide.
Next question is about training from Kendall. So it's likely that all of the new green efficiency related jobs require additional and substantial training. How is that being tackled, especially for new entrants versus ASHRAE types, whatever that means? So training, how do we get it done, and how do we get more into the training sphere?
Sure. Yes. Our work at NYSERDA and statewide on workforce development and training has expanded measurably over the past several years, over $100 million committed all told. And I think, when we think about training, it takes many forms, and that's important, right? To the question at hand, when we look at workforce development, it is the case that there are many vehicles by which workforce development can be advanced. And we at NYSERDA have set forth I don't think I could number the number of programs that we have advanced right now in workforce development. But what we see in terms of the delivery mechanism is that it is focusing not just on higher education. We've put forth tens of millions of dollars to advance various initiatives across the university system with SUNY, CUNY, and other private institutions, but also with organized labor, how we can put forth training programs in, for instance, I just toured 32BJ's facility not too many months ago, where we were launching an initiative for training their workers to work on various HVAC technologies, as well as heat pumps and electrification technologies. So we look at this not just in one place, but in many places and across multiple sectors. Another great example is we just launched the Offshore Wind Training Institute in January as well, which is $20 million. Same thing, looking statewide across multiple delivery mechanisms and with a strong focus on bringing forth these priority populations of New Yorkers who don't have as easy access to these programs.
And I'll just put in a shameless plug for the training programs at Urban Green. You mentioned 32BJ.
Yes.
They're a strong delivery partner for us with our G-Pro training program, which helps train the building trades. And also with NYSERDA's help, we're helping to train architects and engineers on the new energy code, not only in New York City, but across New York State. So check out the great training programs at Urban Green too.
Yes, I should have mentioned that. Thank you.
Thank you. Next question. How does NYSERDA see the role of gas utilities evolving through the CLCPA-driven transition?
Well, clearly, we have a strong focus on the gas, I'll call it the gas delivery system and gas as a whole. I think I've been very clear that our focus is on electrification. as a primary vehicle to reduce emissions from the utility sector delivering from a gas perspective. I think, a couple of things that have come up in the context of the Climate Action Council that are not resolved, but I would say are still emerging. We have members of the Climate Action Council, for instance, Donna DeCarolis from National Fuel Gas is a member of the Climate Action Council, just as an example of this balance of issues that we are grappling with. On the one hand, there is a desire, of course, to minimize emissions of all sorts. But in the other instance, members like Donna would point out the fact that there are reliability considerations and benefits brought forth through existing infrastructure. So I would say the balance of those issues are those that we as a Climate Action Council will be considering and advancing in the coming year. What we are, just to give everyone an idea of the timeline that we're dealing with, the advisory panels are making recommendations to the council this spring. Recommendations may include areas such as those requested by the questioner here, as to specific approaches to our gas delivery system, the resources that are utilizing that system and the like. And then we ultimately are going to take those recommendations into a group of policy scenarios that can be looked at from the perspective of costs and benefits collectively. That will put forth an actual package of initiatives that will help us to hit our goals. So I think to this particular question, the recommendations of the Power Generation Panel will be a great example, and then the deliberations of the Climate Action Council as well.
Next question is really interesting. It's long. I'm not going to read it word for word, but the essence here is the dynamic between building owners and tenants. In this case, if tenants want to make upgrades but building owners aren't cooperating and sharing data, or vice versa, building owners who, want to make their buildings more efficient or carbon neutral, and have the disability because of tenant leases and how their space is used. So, the back end of this question is, how is NYSERDA planning to solve the disconnect between the ownership of buildings and the users of those buildings?
Hey, if it was easy, we wouldn't all have jobs, right? But it is true that particular example is a great example of one of the challenges that we have. As I said, I think it is an issue nationwide, but particularly in the New York City market is relevant. Certainly everyone would say it'd be a lot easier just to introduce these measures in a brand new building with one owner and one occupant, right? But that's not the world in which we live. So I think, one of the major areas that we at NYSERDA have responded with is in our commercial tenant program, which is explicitly designed to support the idea of tenants, as you said, and landlords and consultants as well, in improving these leased spaces through primarily maintenance and operational elements, but also actionable plans to reduce consumption. And I think this program is a great example of bringing to bear information to help with decision making. You pointed out, the questioner pointed out this sort of dichotomy between tenant and owner, but ultimately what that program is designed to do is to bring to bear actual analysis as to what the benefits may be, so as to bring forth the investments that we seek. I think again, we have a number of different programs in this context that are looking to improve the efficiency of the building, but that particular example would be probably the best as to the particular role a tenant can play.
Mm-hmm. Next question is about storage, energy storage.
Mm-hmm.
Is, can we expect a new round of large incentives for energy storage, whether it's batteries or thermal, to support the growth of the renewable infrastructure, particularly for New York City?
Sure. So just to give some idea, I think it is important to note, I'd mentioned the Siting Act that was adopted in 2020. And one of the things that I'm backing up a bit and answering this question because I think it's important to note that one of the requirements of the Siting Act was the completion of a power grid study, which was actually issued just recently by the Department of Public Service in coordination with NYSERDA. And really what that program or what those studies looked at is, explicitly where and how we can deliver the goals of the CLCPA and what are the needs from the perspective of transmission investment, both in the bulk and the subtransmission perspective, but then also how explicitly can we utilize energy storage in the actual operation of the grid. And so for those who haven't reviewed the study, it's I think 740 pages long, so you probably won't want to read the whole thing, but I would say that one of the findings in the work, we called it the 100 by 40 study produced by Siemens, is it does look at the need and the market for energy storage as we look toward a 100 by 40 grid. And so there's a couple of things that are relevant to energy storage, not just what is the goal and what are the incentives. We have certainly seen strong interest since we started our bridge incentives in 2019 in energy storage. But also the studies speak to the market rules, and I would call it the market barriers that exist to energy storage penetration. So we're working closely. One of the most stark examples of those challenges is buyer-side mitigation. The studies speak to the fact that we as a state are working closely with the New York Independent System Operator and in the new federal context with the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission to address some of the very specific challenges to energy storage as it relates to facilitating the grid decarbonization that we seek. So I think the story is not yet written as to how far we go with storage, but I would point you to that study as a strong foundation to establish these future efforts.
Here's a question about RECs that I get a lot myself. So it's what's the plan regarding carbon offsets with local law 97s, OJ, specific offsets, RECs are required. Will the new offshore wind projects help with that? Yeah, can you ask the question? Sorry, I want to make sure I hear. Sorry. Sure, I guess the question is, will the new offshore wind projects qualify for RECs in general, but more specifically for local law 97, which is power delivered into Zone J? Sure. Okay. Just wanting to make sure I understand the question and explicitly. So, if an offshore wind project delivered into Zone J, my understanding on the basis of Local Law 97 and the compliance mechanisms would allow RECs generated by that project to be eligible for purchase by building owners to offset the greenhouse gas limits established by Local Law 97. NYSERDA is obviously the primary purchaser of those attributes on a statewide basis. However, we do have the ability to resell RECs to building owners and to other voluntary buyers as well, should there be interest. You know, it is true, Local Law 97 establishes, I think, pretty particular interest in REC purchase by building owners. I think that it is, of course, as you would expect, what excites us most about Local Law 97 is the efficiency measures that it is intended to spur. However, the ability for RECs to be purchased, I'm sure, will increase the interest in REC buying, either on a voluntary basis independently or through NYSERDA for those RECs delivered into Zone J. Great. Here's a question from Connor. Will the South Fork Wind Farm serve Zone J or any other locations or just Long Island?
Yeah, so the South Fork Wind Farm is actually injecting its energy into East Hampton, so way out on Long Island. So I would say the answer to that would be no explicitly with respect to South Fork. However, there are offshore wind projects that are slated to deliver into New York City. The Empire Wind Project being a great example of that. It's being developed by Equinor. We also just awarded a contract for a project known as Beacon Wind, also being developed by Equinor, and that project is slated to inject into Astoria, into the substation there. So that would be another example of a project that is bringing renewables into the city.
There's a question from Carol. Do single family homes play a role in the carbon neutral map?
Oh, certainly, yes. The carbon neutral buildings roadmap is looking across all buildings, certainly, but it is, I'd say a focal point is on the building stock in the city, which is particularly prevalent for multifamily buildings and high rises and the like.
Scrolling through, here's a question from Roger, basically asking, how can buildings be rewarded for being all electric ready for electrification?
How can they be rewarded? I don't know, John. I don't know if I know the answer to that, other than in the long term, the building is rewarded, of course, because of the long-term efficiency that would exist from the perspective of the supply, as well as the improvement. Yeah,
I've seen NYSERDA starting to do some demonstration projects for electrification. Just what's your view on what role can NYSERDA play with electrification?
Oh, well, I think it's just the beginning as to the role that NYSERDA would be playing in that respect. I'd mentioned the two roadmaps that we are advancing. The second is very much looking at this question of electrification. The questioner had asked, what are the benefits? Well, we're looking at the opportunities. Where can electrification most logically occur? And obviously with what costs and benefits. We at NYSERDA are already doing a lot with respect to electrification, focusing on heating and cooling. $700 million is a lot of money to put to bear on this brand new opportunity that we have as a state, but it's only going to expand.
Okay, we have 20 seconds left. I'm digging deep into the questions.
I was going to say, is it going to be about RECs? No.
Here's one that I love. It says, what's the deal with biomass? Is it actually renewable?
So the answer to that is, per the CLCPA, these types of fuels are not treated as renewable. There remains a question as to whether they have applicability in getting to our broader goals beyond the 70% by 2030. And that is a very direct question before the panels as we speak. Where might there be applicability for biofuels of various sorts in decarbonizing those very hard to decarbonize aspects of our, sectors of our economy? But per the CLCPA, the answer is no, if it's renewable.
Okay, well, I think we'll leave it with that. Doreen, I think we set an Urban Green Live record for the number of questions answered. So thank you very much to you. And I hope the whole audience would join me in thanking Doreen for this really, really informative discussion today. Today's a good example of the work that we do at Urban Green. We take on the biggest challenges with the biggest solutions that have the biggest impact. And I think you saw that today with Doreen. So Doreen, thanks for joining our conversation today.
Well, thank you for having me. I think you also set a record for the most number of questions I've ever answered in a half an hour. So, great questions, and I hope I didn't screw any up too much, but it was great to speak with you, and I do thank you for the opportunity.
I think it was really, really informative. So those of you that are new to Urban Green, you see that, we take on these challenges with four key activities. We convene, we research, we advocate, and we educate. If you don't know us, check us out on our website. And thanks again for everybody for joining the program. Stay safe, stay warm. We'll see you next time. Doreen, take care.
Thank you.